Welcome to this author's interview series. My name is Christina Theodoraki. I'm editor of Small Business Economics and Entrepreneurship Journal, and I have the great honor to interview today Jessica Jones from University of Tennessee. Welcome to you, Jessica, and I would like to thank you for accepting to participate to this interview series and to accept to share your knowledge with us today.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. I'm honored and equally grateful for the opportunity.
So Jessica is going to give us more insight about their paper entitled Does Religion Matter to Angels? Exploring the influence of religion in entrepreneurial investor decision making. This paper is published in Small Business Economics in November 2023. And this paper is co-authored with Christina Hymer from University of Tennessee, Ashley Roccapriore from Auburn University, and Brett Smith from Miami University. So let me start my first questions. What's the idea behind the article? What is the article about?
Great. Yeah. So broadly speaking, it's what the title suggests, but we have essentially look at how angel investors evaluate both ventures and entrepreneurs. And we specifically look at some of the religious claims that the ventures make about their organizational mission. Why angels, you might ask? Not the theoretical one, but the angel investors, in the sense that we know a lot in the literature about investor decision-making from a venture capital perspective, and there's only emerging research to suggest that, one, there's various types of investors, two, that angel investors are inherently different and largely because of two things. One is they invest their own money in comparison to venture capitalists that invest a pool of investment money. And so they have much more discernment over what they do. And two, they often invest earlier on in the stage of the venture where one, less of the venture is known and more of the entrepreneur and their characteristics matter. And you just don't know a lot about what's going to happen. And so this subjective, uncertain context, it's really important to think about some of these other factors that are beyond some of the economic, what can I gain out of this besides just profit? And so why religion? Well, one, it was part of a special issue, but two, we know investors predominantly focus on profit maximization because that is their job. But the rise of different types of investing, where there's a prioritization of non-economic values, have become really interesting and important for not just investors, but also how entrepreneurs seek and understand who they're trying to get investment from. And so you see that with the growth of impact investing, socially responsible investing, ethical investing, and there's this emergence of what's called faith-driven investing. And so this paper specifically looks at how angel investors evaluate religious claims that are made by those entrepreneurial ventures. And we do that through two scenario-based experiments, one with a group of proclaimed faith-driven investors. And so we look at how they evaluate claims made by ventures. And we look at those same claims and we take that to a set of traditional angel investors. And we examine how they evaluate those religious claims made about an organizational mission as they would see in a particular pitch deck. So very similar to what you would see in reality, but we simulate these in scenarios. And at its surface, this idea that religion can be both appealing and repelling is somewhat intuitive. The driving reason is that we are largely attracted to those who are similar to us. And so, for example, it's easy to maybe think that a faith-driven investor would view religious claims made by those entrepreneurial ventures as appealing, but we actually find out that's not always just a blanket statement the case. So we kind of look at some of the granularity there, and we find one particular important aspect of this is that we find that investors who are affiliated with a faith-driven investment group will only view the venture as more favorable if they also perceive the entrepreneur to be authentic or more authentic. And so you don't necessarily get this direct effect of an investor will want to invest in you if you make these claims that are similar to this faith-driven investment group. In contrast, in the context of traditional angel investing, we find that religious claims are not universally what you would think may be repelling. So in this context of, hey, generally speaking, the expectation is you're going to show me as a potential investee, how I'm going to make the most money. And so if I'm talking about my organizational mission as being faith-driven, that might violate that expectation of what I have for you as a potential investee. Well, that negative kind of reaction is not always the case. What we find in this context is that, in fact, when an investor is personally highly religious, that negative effect is kind of mitigated. And so there's some attraction in that way. And so what we really unpack here in this study is this idea that religion is a double-edged sword. And so we're getting into that granularity. And so that's on the religious side of things. And then on the entrepreneurial process side of things, that this angel investor relationship is much more nuanced and complicated. And so we start to unpack and build off of the literature that's showing that.
Excellent. It's extremely interesting, actually, what you situate. And actually, when we're talking about entrepreneurship, we very quickly identify that entrepreneurial finance or investing, it's one of the important topics to explore in entrepreneurship. Often, when I also coach entrepreneurs, they say when we have nice ideas, but if we have funding or investors, this can make it realize. The question, so we know that entrepreneurial finance and investing is extremely important, but what make this article more important, and what we learn more from what we didn't know before from previous literature? Can you situate the originality and the main contribution of this paper? And probably, as we were saying, is this part of the religion? Is that right? Or is how you situate the main contribution and the main, the core finding of this study?
Great. Yeah, so I think we're all looking for why does this matter, right? So a couple of things, and I think one is that religion specifically matters, and in nuanced ways that you wouldn't necessarily think. And so what we want to really highlight, I guess, are two-ish components that really take this paper into kind of why you should care about it. The first is that these claims about the organizational mission that in our context are religious act as a double-edged sword, but it's this idea that the same claim can be attractive to some, but can be completely repelling to others. And so while the literature has described that investors, yes, have differences, both in terms of the types of investors they are, and then the types of personalities that they have and what they subjectively look at, we are starting to unpack and build off of that. So we're showing that, and it's exemplified in this use of religious claims. But religious claims are much more granular than that. We even go to specify that this claim has an impact at two different levels. So at this macro level, when we think about the culture and the groups that we're a part of, the use of contrasting this faith-driven group, where in reality, if you're kind of in that group, you would start to think that, well, the culture of me describing myself as, or my organization as faith-driven, should inherently matter more. We start to get into why that is important, but then also at a more personal level, we look at investor religiosity. And so we start to tease apart those two, and importantly, kind of provide some specific contexts and ways in which they do and don't matter as much. And I think that goes into looking at this broader cultural context, but then also this different levels of analysis. So what we are looking at is both institutional logic, so these norms and behaviors in particular situations, but then also whether or not they're disclosed as it pertains to their personal beliefs. And we look at that both from the investor side as well as the entrepreneur side. So yes, it's this religion matters, but it's also like, how do we understand who our audience is? And to what extent are we disclosing some of those aspects about who we are and what our organization is? Importantly, the other contribution that we see is we start to disentangle, I guess I should say, the difference between the perception that investors evaluate upon the entrepreneur and the venture. So very often we see in studies, we look at investors' perception of the entrepreneur and those characteristics and how they view that particular person or founder. or the venture and how they view the venture in terms of whether or not they see that venture as legitimate, if they perceive it as investable in one way, shape, or form. Here, we actually look at both, and we see this interactive effect in the sense that, for example, the faith-driven investors, they actually only view the venture. So I only actually look at whether or not I'm going to invest if the entrepreneur in and of that person is perceived to be authentic. So you see that just examining one or the other would have different effects and outcomes. And here we're actually looking at both. And so I think that granularity is important as it pertains to investor decision-making because there is so much more beneath the surface.
Definitely. Can I take you now to the very early beginning, like the Eureka moment? How did this idea came from? What inspired you to start this research project?
Yeah, so my dissertation was related to impact investing. So for a number of years, I spent a lot of time hanging out with and trying to understand the emergence of this whole group of individuals, ranging from institutional investors to individuals to philanthropies, all kind of convening around this idea that we can't just have an economic paradigm for our decision making and how we actually make and move and provide resources. And so at the same time, I was also working alongside many entrepreneurial ventures who were pursuing social value in some way, shape, or form. And along that path, I came to find this group of faith-driven investors. And it was very curious to me how they were able to disclose this group and also kind of be able to pinpoint who and where and how they were investing their resources. And I think it's just an incredible case of some of this ability to prioritize non-economic value and contribute in a much more broader way. And what made them explicitly faith-driven, how were they thinking in terms of their decisions and why they were actually valuing some of the things they did and how that did actually make an economic case for themselves. I was in part of a previous study that looked at the actual investors themselves and how the group of faith-driven investors managed some of these competing identities in terms of their own self. So how did I manage both this economic desire as part of my job, as well as this faith purpose-driven kind of component in thinking about identity. And we have a study in Journal of Business Ethics that relates to this identity multiplicity component. And so this study extends that line of work and brings religion to the forefront here. And what we're trying to do is kind of contribute to this theological turn in entrepreneurship, where religion is really an explicit part. No longer are they necessarily hiding it. Yes, it can matter, but it's also becoming a very explicit part of how they are doing business.
This is great. And actually, you give me the floor for my next question, because you were saying, I was going to ask you, what is the next step? What is your ongoing research or future research direction? And you were talking about this identity. But actually, can you tell us what you see that we still don't know yet, or what research we need further to dig on, or probably what would be the examples to continue to advance this topic?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I think first and foremost from because we've been talking specifically about this idea of religion at the forefront, I think what's interesting is this is a study where we were able to explicitly look at religion as a part of the theoretical model. And what is new about that is that I don't think that it's new to study religion in religious contexts, but more often than not, religion has been kind of relegated to either a control variable or kind of embedded in this idea of like a cultural construct, so religiosity of a region, et cetera, or it's been part of the research context and consider this idea of an extreme context that might be able to be generalized across different areas. A great example of this is Kreiner et al. Doing identity work in 2006. There's an AMJ where they studied Episcopalian priests, but the only mention of religion is in this very deep and embedded research design where they're looking at priesthood. But it's hard to unlock and think about the fact that religion doesn't have a factor, and why can't it be part of the theoretical model rather than just the research design. So I think that's kind of the forefront of, if people are interested in that, we're trying to provide some sort of pathway to think about it in the theoretical model specifically. And I think another way to do that is thinking beyond some of these abstract proxies. So one thing that we try to contribute to here is we look at the religiosity of the individual as a belief. And so there's this big difference between religious practices and religious beliefs, and not to confuse those, and try to understand what those differences really are. So in a lot of prior work, we look at church going as a practice. So when you survey and sample individuals and say, well, they're highly religious because they go to church every Sunday, that may or may not be the case, or that may or may not be theoretically very distinct from how they practice or believe in their faith, and how that inherently comes out in the workplace. So as it pertains to the workplace, I think there's two different ways to really bring religion to the fore in a way that we haven't necessarily before. And there's avenues to do that. So this was a special issue that we were able to publish in. So we felt a little bit more able in many ways to think about religion as part of the theoretical model, rather than just part of this contrasting aspect of two different types of angel investors. There's another, and the timeliness of this interview is kind of great. There's another special issue in entrepreneurship and regional development that abstracts are due in a few days, January 15th, I think you can, but that is on religious entrepreneurship. So we're starting, there is this kind of path forward on thinking about bringing religion as part of the theoretical model. As it pertains to our study, I think a couple of things. One is, this was a scenario-based experiment. So we were asking hypothetical situations and because it was an experiment, we had to be pretty clean about our sample and how we presented religious claims. And so we know this is a bit more nuanced. So a couple ways to take this forward is, one, thinking about actual samples where we can look at the process of investor decision-making and getting inside the head and relational aspects of both the investor and entrepreneur in terms of that exchange. And I think that other piece of that is, there's a lot about disclosure that we do and do not kind of think about, especially as it pertains to some of these more cultural aspects. So here in this instance, we were assuming that disclosure in a particular pitch was the first time that these investors would potentially see this particular fact. Hypothetically, maybe the investors know about this mission before they see it in a pitch deck, or before they get to talking to them, or maybe it's after. And so when that disclosure happens of some of these non-economic aspects are also probably an important nuance to think about moving forward.
Excellent, Jessica. And actually, I was waiting this very last question. The last questions are reflected to the findings and how they can be applied. And most of the research, I'm interested to see what are your advices as an expert to practitioners, and how you can provide from your research some recommendations to implement, and how you can see your research has an impact to the entrepreneurial society. And most of the time, we see that we have recommendations for entrepreneurs, for companies, for probably founders or investors, or even politicians. And I'm very curious to see the religious part, to see, do you have any recommendation for the church, or how do you see these aspects? So I don't know how you can elaborate it, how we can apply finally your findings.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic point. I mean, I think there's a lot of ways in, so I'll go a couple of different directions that I think are really important, especially as it pertains to society today. One is just in general respect for some of the differences that we all have, and just understanding that we can no longer necessarily ignore or place by the side some of these societal and cultural attributes like religion, as it pertains to the way that we move in the workplace, and as it pertains to entrepreneurship, entrepreneurs, and how they pursue their businesses. And so from an investor standpoint, what I would say to investors is that there is a general subjective aspect of this, and to better understand and consider how some of their subjectivity is playing into some of the potential ways in which they're looking at investments. And that is different based on how the person as well as the venture. And so trying to think about and tease apart when it comes to their decision-making processes, really taking apart the entrepreneur and the venture and some of these broader aspects. The second for entrepreneurs, and there's a broad literature on this, on entrepreneurial framing, pitching, and narratives and storytelling, but our study really unpacks whether and when to integrate religion and to whom into their organizational mission, obviously if that's relevant or not. But I think what that unpacks is that there's certain expectations that entrepreneurs have when they walk into a room with a particular audience. And so it goes beyond just knowing your audience to really understanding how do you unpack and how do you think about the signals that may or may not align with investors at a particular stage. And then I think another piece, and this is where I come from too, is from an entrepreneurial support organization standpoint. So much of training in accelerators and programs are about framing and how do you get the pitch and how do you navigate some of these contexts where you find and align with some of these investors. And we've studied so much about status or warm introductions and these things that are much more emotional on the cognitive side. Well, we're kind of unpacking is that there also is this religious cognition that might be underlying some of these other factors too. And so really thinking and starting to consider and open up that black box a little bit more to make that more granular in a way that we can understand that or just be cognizant of when it comes to thinking that an investor is not just an investor and it's the same. It's not apples and oranges. They are so different and they have unique differences as well. And I think more importantly, beyond, there's this idea of alignment between investor and entrepreneur. So the claims made to align with the investor might increase the evaluations of the entrepreneur's character, but that might not always carry or extend to the investment. So they might think I'm a really cool person because I align with them, but does that mean that they're going to invest in me? No, you probably need to do the work and you probably just have to have a good business to begin with. But yes, so there's some of that as well that I think are important in terms of practical applications.
Thank you very, very much, Jessica, for all these insights, for also this, for contributing with this study and contributing to the special issue, which is extremely important from the one side of its originality, but also because it opened a discussion. And as you say, this is all about research, is how we open discussion, we observe the entrepreneurial society, and we're trying to do impactful research to understand how society evolves and provide a useful recommendations for policy and practice. As you say, we open this discussion reflecting this religion. I think this is extremely promising research direction to continue to evolve. And you are also stating some other special issues ongoing that are now with entrepreneurship and regional development. And I'm extremely interested to see how this research direction is going to flourish the next years. In any case, I would like to thank you and your team for contributing for Small Business Economics and the special issue, which is available online. Readers can download your paper and as well as the other papers of the special issue. And we very much look forward to see how this topic will flourish at the next years. Thank you very, very much.
Awesome. Thank you.